My son stopped me on the porch steps last Thursday morning. Not my son, actually his wife, Carol. She was standing at the bottom of my front steps, with that tight smile she always wore when she wanted something. The one that never quite reached her eyes. "Eleanor," she said, tilting her head the way a person does when they're pretending to be concerned. "Have you taken a good look at the cabinet in your dining room lately?" I didn't know what she meant. I told her so. She waved her hand as if it didn't matter, said something about just being curious, then drove away in that black SUV that cost more than my first house. I stood on my porch, watching her taillights disappear around the corner, and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not fear, exactly. More like the feeling you get right before a storm, when the air goes still and the birds stop singing and everything in the world seems to be holding its breath. I'm glad you're here. Please like this video and stay with me until the very end, because this story changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. And tell me, in the comments, where are you watching from? I love knowing how far these stories travel. I had lived in my house on Maple Grove Lane for 31 years. My husband, Robert, and I had bought it together the spring after our daughter, Diane, was born, a wide-framed craftsman with a deep porch, original hardwood floors, and enough room in the backyard for a vegetable garden that Robert tended every summer until the day he couldn't anymore. He passed away 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and merciless. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I was 67 years old, a retired school teacher, and I was alone in a house full of memories. My daughter Diane visited on Sundays with her husband, Marcus, and their 2 kids. My son, David, lived 40 minutes away and called on Saturdays reliably every single week. I had my routines. Every Thursday morning I drove to First Methodist for our women's Bible study group, then stopped at the farmer's market on the way home. I was gone from 9 until nearly 1. The house sat empty, quiet, the way old houses do, full of the sounds of settling wood and ticking clocks. Robert had been an antiques collector for most of his adult life. Not the obsessive kind, not the kind who haunted auctions and spent money we didn't have. He just had an eye for things. Over the decades, he'd filled our home with pieces he loved. A Georgian secretary desk in the study, a pair of matching mahogany side tables in the dining room, a tall case clock in the front hallway that had belonged to his grandfather. None of it was museum quality, but it was real, and it was ours. And after Robert died, those pieces became something more than furniture to me. They were the shape of our life together. The first strange thing I noticed was small enough to dismiss. The brass handles on the mahogany side tables had always had a particular patina, warm and dark in the grooves, the way old brass gets when decades of hands have touched it. One afternoon in late February, I was dusting and noticed the handles looked different. Shinier, brighter, like new brass, not old brass. I stood there for a long moment, turning one of them in my fingers, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. I had cleaned them recently, I told myself. Maybe I had used a different polish. Maybe the afternoon light was playing tricks. I set it aside. 2 weeks later, I noticed something harder to ignore. The tall case clock in the hallway, Robert's grandfather's clock, had a small chip on the lower right corner of the base. I knew that chip the way I knew my own reflection. Diane had knocked against it when she was 9 years old, dragging her bicycle through the front hallway against every rule I'd ever set. And the corner had caught the wall. The chip was small but distinctive. A pale crescent of raw wood against the dark walnut stain. I had looked at it thousands of times. One Tuesday morning, I walked past the clock and stopped cold. The chip was gone. The corner was smooth and perfect, the stain uniform all the way to the floor. My mouth went dry. I crouched down and ran my fingers over the base. The wood felt different, slightly lighter in color. The grain pattern, when I looked closely, wasn't quite right. This was not Robert's grandfather's clock. I stood up slowly. The room felt like it had tilted 2 degrees. I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself and stood there in my own front hallway, staring at a clock that looked exactly like the one I'd lived with for 30 years, but was not the same clock, and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I mentioned it to my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, when she came over that Friday for coffee. Margaret Chen had lived next door for 16 years. We weren't the type of neighbors who borrowed cups of sugar, but we had reached the easy companionship of 2 women who had grown old on the same street and trusted each other quietly and without a lot of fuss. She set down her mug and looked at me. "Eleanor," she said carefully, "I need to tell you something. I wasn't sure whether I should, but now I think I should." She folded her hands on the table the way she does when she's choosing her words. "A few weeks ago, on a Thursday morning, I saw a van parked in front of your house, a white cargo van. 2 men were carrying something out through your front door, a large piece of furniture, wrapped in moving blankets. I thought maybe you were having something repaired, but I've seen the van twice more since then. Always on a Thursday. Always while you're gone." The silence in my kitchen was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming. "Did you see who let them in?" I asked. "A woman was with them," Mrs. Chen said. "I only saw her from behind, but she was driving a black SUV. Carol." I didn't say the name out loud. I sat with it inside me, turning it over, looking for another explanation. Marcus's wife. My son David's sister-in-law. Technically, though they'd never been close. Carol, who had a degree in interior design and had once spent an entire Sunday dinner talking about the secondary market for American antique furniture. I thought about calling David. I thought about calling Diane. But I kept seeing Carol's face on my porch steps. That thin smile. That tilted head. "Have you taken a good look at the cabinet in your dining room lately?" She had been asking me, I realized, whether I had noticed, testing to see how closely I was paying attention. I was paying attention now. That same afternoon, I drove to the public library and used one of the computers to research the pieces Robert had collected. The Georgian secretary desk alone, I discovered, was worth between $8,000 and $14,000 at auction. The mahogany side tables, if they were genuine Hepplewhite, which Robert had always believed they were, could fetch $5,000 each. The tall case clock, if it was what his family had always said it was potentially the most valuable piece in the house. 6 months ago, I would have told you I had no idea what any of these things were worth. Now, I was sitting in the library on a Tuesday afternoon reading auction catalogs, and every number I saw made me feel sicker. I went home and I walked through every room. The secretary desk had been replaced. I was certain of it now, the proportions were right, but the interior compartments were wrong. The small brass lock plate on the center drawer was a different shape than I remembered. The side tables were fakes. The clock was a fake. I pulled out my phone and photographed every piece, every detail, every joint and hinge and hardware fitting I could reach. In Robert's study, I found the folder where he kept his records. He had been meticulous, the way collectors are: receipts, provenance documents, photographs, appraisals going back decades. I pulled out the appraisal for the tall case clock and sat on the floor of his study and looked at the photograph stapled to the top of the page. There, in the lower right corner of the clock's base, was the chip, pale crescent of raw wood against dark walnut stain. Exactly where it had always been. Estimated value at time of appraisal, $42,000. The clock currently standing in my hallway was a reproduction worth perhaps $42,000. I sat on the floor of my husband's study for a long time. I want to be honest with you. Because you've stayed this long, and you deserve honesty. Part of me, a significant part, did not want it to be Carol. Because if it was Carol, then my son David, who had married into Carol's family and spent every holiday with her brother Marcus and sister-in-law Diane. The whole architecture of my remaining family became something I had to question. I did not want to question it. I was 67 years old, and I had already lost Robert, and I did not want to lose anything else. But wanting something to not be true does not make it not true. I called my friend, Helen, who had worked as a paralegal for 30 years before retiring. We had been friends since Diane was in preschool. I told her what I had found. She listened without interrupting, which is one of Helen's finest qualities. "You need a camera," she said. "Before you call anyone, before you confront anyone, you need video proof. Because without it, Eleanor, I promise you they will say you're confused. They will say you misidentified the pieces. They will say you don't know what you had." She was right. I knew she was right. Helen's grandson set up the cameras the following Saturday, while I told David I was having the gutters cleaned. An excuse that required David to stay home, which he did without question, because David had always been a good son, and I was trying very hard not to think about what David might or might not know. The cameras were small, one hidden in the bookshelf flanking the front hallway, angled toward the door and the clock. One in the dining room, behind a row of pottery, on the open shelving Robert and I had built together the summer after Diane started kindergarten. I waited. The following Thursday, I drove to Bible study, sat through an hour of scripture and fellowship with women I had known for 20 years, ate a lemon bar, and felt absolutely nothing. My mind was 3 miles away, in an empty house, with 2 cameras blinking in the dark. I left early. Told Pastor Morrison's wife I had a headache, which was not entirely false. I sat in the parking lot of the Walgreens 2 blocks from my house and watched the minutes pass on my phone. At 11:43, Mrs. Chen texted me. White van just pulled up. Black SUV behind it. My hands were steady. I was surprised by that. At 12:51, I drove home. The van was gone. The SUV was gone. I walked into my house and stood in the hallway and looked at the clock, and then walked through every room, trying to see what was different. In the dining room, the cabinet that Carol had asked me about on the porch steps a small painted Pennsylvania Dutch piece that Robert had bought at a farmhouse sale in Lancaster County was gone. In its place stood something similar in shape and color, but wrong in every detail that mattered. I downloaded the footage that evening. Helen sat beside me at the kitchen table. The dining room camera showed Carol arriving first, alone, at 11:17. She walked through my house with complete familiarity, opening drawers, pulling out cushions, moving through rooms I had not invited her into. Behind her came 2 men with a hand truck and moving blankets. While they wrapped the Lancaster cabinet, Carol stood in front of the tall case clock with her phone out, photographing it. Then she spoke to one of the men. The camera's audio was clear enough. "Not the clock yet," Carol said. "It's the biggest ticket item. We wait until she agrees to the move." "The move," the man nodded. "The side tables are already at the shop. Desmond says they sold Tuesday. 14,000. Carol smiled. It was the same smile she had given me on the porch steps. Perfect. Keep the invoices separate. Nothing traceable back to the family account. I paused the video. Helen and I sat in silence for a moment. "The move," I said. "She's planning to get you out of the house," Helen said quietly. "Once you're in assisted living, the house goes on the market. Everything inside it gets liquidated. And by then, everything valuable has already been replaced with fakes. So, there's nothing left to prove what was taken." I pressed play again. At 12:31, a third person arrived. I had to watch the hallway footage 3 times before I believed what I was seeing. Because I had spent 31 years loving this person. The front door opened, and my son, David, walked into my house. He walked in with the key I had given him for emergencies. He stood in the hallway and looked at the clock and then walked to the dining room doorway and looked at the empty space where the Lancaster cabinet had been. Carol turned around when she heard him. "She notice anything?" he asked. "Not yet," Carol said. "She's too busy with her church group to look closely." She paused. "David, the appraiser says the clock and the desk together are worth nearly $60,000. We need to move faster." David was quiet for a moment. Then, "She's my mother. She's going to end up in a facility regardless." "You've said so yourself. At least this way, the money goes to us instead of to an estate sale." Carol's voice was perfectly pleasant, the voice of someone discussing a minor logistical problem. "Marcus and Diane have agreed to their share. Everyone benefits." "She's my mother," David said again, but quieter this time. And then he turned and walked back through the hallway and out the front door. And I watched him leave my house on a screen in my kitchen and felt something in me go very still. He had not stopped them. He had walked away and let it continue. I sat with that for a long time that night after Helen went home. I sat in Robert's armchair, the real one, the one they hadn't taken yet, and I thought about David at 7 years old bringing me dandelions in a fistful because he'd seen me cry after a hard day. I thought about him calling every Saturday for 4 years after his father died. I thought about Carol. By morning, my grief had become something harder and more useful. I called Robert's attorney, James Whitfield, who had handled our estate planning and knew the full inventory of Robert's collection. I told him what I had found. He was silent for a moment, and then he said words that I found more steadying than almost anything else I had heard in recent months. "Eleanor, you are not confused. You are not overreacting. What you are describing is felony theft, and the fact that family members are involved makes it worse, not better. May I ask, do you want to pursue this fully?" "Yes," I said. "I do." James contacted a private investigator named Sandra Oakes, who spent 2 weeks establishing a paper trail. The white cargo van was registered to a moving and storage company owned by a man named Desmond Farrell, Carol's college roommate's husband. Desmond's shop in a strip mall 20 minutes outside of town had received and resold 7 pieces from my home over the preceding 4 months. The mahogany side tables had sold to a dealer in Philadelphia. A set of Canton china from Robert's study had been purchased by a couple in Connecticut. A Federal period mirror from the upstairs hallway was listed on a consignment website for $3,800. Sandra also found the messages. Carol had been careless, or perhaps arrogant, because she had coordinated much of this through a group text with Marcus and Diane. Not David. David was not in the thread. I held on to that detail the way you hold a handhold on a steep climb. He hadn't been in the planning. He had found out and done nothing, which was its own kind of betrayal. But he hadn't planned it. The messages were methodical and unsentimental. Carol had documented which pieces she had already moved, which remained, their estimated auction values, the projected timeline for moving me to a facility. She had contacted 3 assisted living communities on my behalf without my knowledge, and had spoken to a geriatric care manager about initiating a capacity evaluation. I was perfectly competent. But competence can be manufactured into doubt if the people around you are motivated and patient. 2 weeks before James filed the police report, my phone rang on a Sunday evening. It was Diane. "Mom," she said, and her voice had the careful warmth of someone reading from a script. "Marcus and I have been talking. We think it might be time for a real conversation about your living situation. The house is a lot to manage alone. We worry about you." I closed my eyes. There it was. "I'm fine, Diane. You know we love you. We just want what's best for you." Carol actually found a beautiful place over in Westfield. We took a tour last week, and it's really— "You toured a facility for me," I said, without telling me. A pause. "We just wanted to have information ready, in case." "In case what?" Another pause. Longer. Mom, please don't make this difficult. I thought about the Lancaster cabinet that had stood in my dining room since before Diane was born. I thought about Robert spending a Saturday afternoon in Lancaster County bargaining with a farmer over a painted cabinet because he had an eye for beautiful things and wanted to bring beauty into our home. I'm not making anything difficult, I said. You are, and I need you to know that I know exactly what's happening. And it's going to stop. I hung up. 3 days later, on a Thursday morning, I drove to Bible study. I ate a lemon bar. I sat with women I had known for 20 years and I felt, for the first time in months, a clean and uncomplicated peace because I had made my decision. And it was the right one. And nothing that came next was going to change it. At 11:32, Mrs. Chen texted. I drove home. I parked down the street, walked to my front door, and let myself in quietly. Carol was in the dining room. Desmond Farrell and one of his workers were in the study, wrapping the Georgian secretary desk in moving blankets. It was the last major piece. The desk Robert had bought at an estate sale in Virginia 20 years ago, the one he had refinished himself in our garage over the course of an entire summer, the one where I had sat every Christmas Eve for 30 years writing cards. Carol heard me come in and turned around. Her expression moved through several things very quickly. Surprise, then calculation, then the pleasant professional mask she wore like a second skin. Eleanor, I was just, don't. My voice was calm. I was surprised by how calm it was. I have video of every visit. I have the text messages from your group thread. I have the sales records from Desmond's shop. I have a report filed with the police and an attorney who has seen all of it. I looked past her to the two men in the study, who had stopped moving. I'd like you all to leave my home now. Carol recovered faster than I expected. She had spent 20 years as a professional, and it showed. Eleanor, I understand you're upset, but I want you to hear me out. Everything we've done has been for your benefit. The pieces we moved, we were having them appraised for insurance purposes. You know Robert's records are outdated. We were going to surprise you with updated documentation. The pieces you moved were sold. In Philadelphia. In Connecticut. I have the invoices. Maybe Noonmere. De C hundreds served der. D. Something shifted in her face. Those were consignment arrangements. Temporary. Carol. She stopped. I have video of you standing in front of my husband's clock saying, not the clock yet. It's the biggest ticket item. I have video of you telling your associate that the side tables sold for $14,000. I have your text messages where you divided the proceeds between yourself, Marcus, and my daughter. I paused. I am 67 years old, and I have lived alone for 4 years, and I have never once been confused about what belongs to me. The pleasant mask was gone. What remained was something harder and colder, and more honest. You're going to regret this, Carol said. You have no idea how complicated you're making things. Diane and Marcus will fight this. David was in this house one Thursday watching you work and walked away without stopping you. I know that. I have that on video too. My voice didn't waver. I'm not angry at David. I'm heartbroken for him. But that's a separate matter. You'll look like a paranoid old woman, Carol said. And now there was an edge to her voice that she was no longer bothering to conceal. Making accusations against her own family. Do you think people won't wonder? Do you think your friends, your church, won't wonder if maybe you're not quite as sharp as you used to be? We can make that narrative very convincing. Then I suppose you'll try, I said. Get out of my house. They left. Desmond and his worker put the secretary desk down in the hallway and walked out without a word. Carol paused in the doorway. Robert would be ashamed of you, she said. Choosing lawyers over family. I opened the door wider. After she left, I sat down on the floor of my front hallway. right beside the tall case clock, the reproduction. The fake and I put my back against the wall and I cried for about 10 minutes. Not from fear, not from self-pity, from the sheer, exhausting weight of realizing that people you love are capable of things you never imagined. Then I got up, washed my face, and called James Whitfield. The police report was filed that afternoon. Sandra Oaks delivered her full investigative file the following morning. James had also contacted a forensic accountant named Patricia Doyle, who spent 2 weeks tracing every transaction, every sale, every transfer, every invoice from Desmond Farrell's shop. The total value of items removed from my home over 6 months came to just under $90,000. Of that, approximately $62,000 had already been sold, and the proceeds distributed among Carol, Marcus, and Diane in roughly equal shares. David had received nothing. As far as the financial records showed, David had not participated. He called me on a Wednesday night, 3 weeks after the confrontation. I almost didn't answer. "Mom." His voice was rough. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know that nothing I say is an excuse, because there is no excuse." I waited. I found out in January what Carol was doing, what Marcus and Diane had agreed to. He exhaled. "I told Carol to stop. She said it was already in motion. I said I would tell you. She said if I did, she would tell Diane and Marcus that I'd been involved from the beginning, and none of them would back me up." A long pause. "I was afraid. I chose being afraid over protecting you. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." I sat with that for a long time before I spoke. "David," I said finally, "I believe you, and I love you, but I can't pretend that walking away from what you saw was a small thing. It wasn't a small thing. Those were your father's pieces. That was your father's clock. I know. I need some time. I know. I'm glad you called." He was crying when we hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand and thought about the fact that grief and love can occupy the same space without canceling each other out. Robert had always understood that better than I did. The arrests came on a Friday. Carol and Desmond Farrell were taken into custody and charged with felony theft, receiving stolen property, and conspiracy. The charges against Marcus and Diane were filed the following week: conspiracy and accessory to theft. Diane called me from the police station. I did not answer. She left a voicemail. Her voice was unrecognizable, stripped of everything practiced and smooth, just raw and fractured. Mom, please. I have children, please. I didn't think I thought the stuff was just sitting there, and you'd never." A long silence. "I thought you wouldn't notice." That was the part that stayed with me. I thought you wouldn't notice. They had all thought the same thing. That I was old enough, and lonely enough, and worn down enough by grief that I would not notice, and if I did notice, I would doubt myself before I doubted them. They had used my love for them as a weapon against me. They had counted on the fact that I would find it easier to question my own mind than to question my children. They were wrong. The trial took place the following spring. James Whitfield was thorough and relentless. Sandra Oaks testified about the investigation. Patricia Doyle walked the jury through the financial trail with the patience of a very good schoolteacher. And I testified clearly, precisely, with dates and amounts, and the provenance documents Robert had kept in his careful folders for 40 years. Carol's attorney tried. He suggested that I had given Carol permission to have pieces appraised, that my memory of events was selective, that a woman living alone for 4 years might reasonably have trouble keeping track of a large home full of valuable objects. He was polished and professional, and the jury did not believe a word of it, because video evidence does not misremember things, and neither do bank records, and neither do text messages in which Carol wrote, in her own words, to her own brother, "The clock stays until she's in the facility." then it all goes at once. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Carol received 5 years. Desmond Farrell received 3. Marcus received 2 years probation and community service. His sentence reduced in exchange for full cooperation with investigators. He had provided the most complete account of how the scheme had originated. Carol's idea, developed over more than a year, presented to Marcus and Diane as a practical solution to a problem they had all been privately discussing. What to do about Mom? Diane received 2 years probation and a fine. She wept throughout sentencing. I sat in the courtroom and looked at my daughter, who had grown up in the house on Maple Grove Lane, who had knocked her bicycle against Robert's grandfather's clock when she was 9 years old, who had stood at our kitchen table and eaten lemon bars her whole childhood. I looked at her and felt the full weight of everything that was broken between us, and I did not look away. The civil judgment was awarded in June, $91,000 in restitution plus damages. James had also filed for the return of every item that could be recovered. The secretary desk came back from a dealer in New Jersey. The Federal Mirror was recovered from the consignment listing before it sold. The side tables were gone. The Canton china was gone. Some things, once lost, stay lost. But the tall case clock, Robert's grandfather's clock, with the pale crescent chip in the lower right corner of the base, was located in a private collector's home in Pennsylvania. James sent a demand letter. The collector, to his credit, had not known the piece was stolen. He returned it voluntarily and without litigation. The morning it came back, 2 men from a moving company carried it through my front door and set it in the hallway where it had always stood. I waited until they left. Then I crouched down and put my fingers on the chip in the lower corner pale crescent of raw wood against dark walnut stain. And I stayed there for a long time. Mr. Henderson from across the street helped me that afternoon hang a new deadbolt on the back door. He is 74 years old and has lived on Maple Grove Lane longer than anyone. And he brought a casserole the week after the arrest and has not once asked me to explain myself or justify my choices, which I consider one of the finest gifts a neighbor can give. Mrs. Chen and I have started taking a watercolor class on Wednesday mornings at the senior center. She is considerably better at it than I am. I told her so last week, and she laughed and said, "You're better at everything else, Eleanor. Let me have this." David and I speak on the phone every Saturday. It is not the same as before. Some things, once broken, change their shape even after they're repaired. But we are building something, slowly and honestly, and I think Robert would understand that too. I donate 2 mornings a week to an elder advocacy organization in our county. I sit across from other women and sometimes men, people my age and older, and I listen to what has been done to them by people they trusted. And I tell them what I know. I tell them that clarity is not the same as youth, that sharpness is not the same as speed, that the fact that someone loves you does not mean they are safe to trust completely, and that the willingness to document, to question, to hold your ground, that is not paranoia, that is dignity. They thought I wouldn't notice. I noticed. If you are watching this and something in your home feels wrong, trust that feeling. Write it down. Find one person, a neighbor, a friend, a lawyer, anyone who will believe you and help you document what you know. You are not confused. You are not too old. You are not a problem to be managed or a resource to be divided. You are a person. And you deserve to live in your home, surrounded by the things you have built and earned and loved. For as long as you choose. Thank you for listening. Stay safe, stay strong, and never let anyone make you doubt what you know to be true.